Hello again, folks, and welcome to your third critical thinking lesson, analysis. We're going to define what analysis is and then show you two different examples, one from the Odyssey and one that you could use in your research. To analyze something means to take it apart and look at each individual component of the larger whole. You will decide what each individual piece says and how what that thing says relates back to the larger picture. Each piece might say a different thing, and each different thing may or may not be relevant to the larger picture depending on your purpose or goal. So you will take that purpose and goal and keep it in mind as you're analyzing each individual piece. For an example, say you're looking at a jigsaw puzzle of a cat sitting in a field of flowers. You will take apart each individual piece, see what part of the picture is on it, and understand how that part of the picture relates back to the larger image. If the cat sitting in the field of flowers is the picture, but you really want to just focus on the flowers, you would take only those pieces that have flower on them. Some of them may be pink, some of them may be yellow, and you would think about how those pinks and the yellows relate back to the larger picture of all the colors of flowers together. To take it back to our Odyssey example, we were to do an analysis of this character's behavior. So it says, throughout the story, Penelope is shown to have great loyalty. Do an analysis of her behavior that reveals instances where she shows this trait. So, because an analysis means to take something apart into all of its individual pieces, let's take this apart. The first thing we need to do is decide what our purpose and goal is. After we figure that out, we can decide what pieces from the Odyssey would serve that purpose or goal. After we've got all that established, we can think about how we put these pieces together to understand the deal of Penelope's loyalty. Our purpose here is to prove that Penelope is loyal. We are doing this analysis in order to establish the question of her loyalty. So we need to look throughout the story and see where Penelope shows that loyalty. As we go and establish that loyalty, it's important to look at each of her actions and determine what trait they show. Remember that an analysis is to start with the big picture and pull it out to each individual piece. So that big picture here is Penelope as a character, as a person, her entire personality. And when we analyze that, we pull out for each individual action to see if those actions demonstrate her loyalty and how they demonstrate her loyalty. One action that we can definitely include is when she hides up in her room and weaves that shroud and unweaves it every night to avoid having to choose another man besides Odysseus. So she shows her love by being loyal to Odysseus and refusing to choose anyone else besides him. Another instance is when she takes care of his house even though he's away. All the suitors are destroying her house, eating all her food, abusing her servants, and she stays loyal to her husband's house rules. She could have kicked these men out and forsaken Greek culture, but she's loyal to her husband's house rules, what her husband would expect of her, what society would expect of her, and she does exactly what she is expected to do. So how should we put these pieces together? First, let's establish what we've got. We've got our purpose, which is to prove that she is a loyal wife. And we've got a couple instances from the story in which she shows loyalty to Odysseus and to his house. So how do we put those two together to make a conclusion? As I'm sure is very clear, Penelope is a loyal wife, and we've shown this by analyzing her behavior throughout the story. So she shows her loyalty by continuously choosing to wait for Odysseus and to tend to his house rather than forsake him and her duties for one of the suitors. So we started out with the big picture of her as a person and then took it apart into her individual behaviors that make up her personality and decided that she is indeed loyal based on taking apart her personality. Analysis is a very important skill for research papers because you're going to need to analyze the information in each source you choose and come across. You have to decide for yourself what your source is really saying and also what it doesn't say. So you will need to take the source as a whole and parse apart all the information and decide what it is that you will use in your paper. What is it that works for your argument? Once you pull that all information together, you must make a conclusion based on the information in that source. Again, what is it really that this source is arguing, and what is it that it is not arguing? Be very careful to look at only what's important in that source, because if you take one line that sounds cool, hidden in a paragraph, and try to base your conclusion on it, it's not going to work, because that is just one line and not the larger body of work, the larger picture in that jigsaw puzzle of a source. And also, that ties back to keeping all your details in mind when making your argument, because if you cut out some important details that the source has, you're being untrue to the source, and your paper will not have the accuracy that that source has. Let's continue our example of this dragon paper we've been working on. In the last video, we did an evaluation and found one really good source for our paper. Now let's do an analysis of the same source to find out what details from that source we can pull out and use in our paper. Remember that the source we chose was called The Evolution of Dragon Legends, From Cave Paintings to Modern Fantasy. It was written by Taylor Hannigan and was printed by a reputable publisher, so it's a good source, and it's very topical to what we've chosen to write our paper about, which is dragon lore and how that's evolved in different cultures. So let's open this source and find some points of information inside it and see what it is that is relevant to our paper. How can we analyze this big source into smaller pieces of information? Let's take a look at the kind of information we've gotten from this source. First, we know that the earliest references to dragons are shown in cave paintings. We also know that these paintings are drawn in ink made from berries and animal blood. Hunters' tall tales helped the dragon legend grow. Stories and myths with dragons were told to scare children and to teach them lessons. Different cultures evolved to either fear or worship these mythical beasts. And lastly, we know that after the first of dragon legends were written down, the legend started to fade. So there are many commonalities between these pieces of information we've gotten from our source, but how can we use these commonalities in order to make a larger argument? How can we analyze what this source as a whole says in order to build upon our larger argument in our essay? So these are the ones that are most topical to our point and most related to each other. Hunters' tall tales helped dragon legend grow. Stories and myths with dragons were told to scare children and teach them lessons, and that after the first dragon tales were written down, the legend started to fade. What is it that these three pieces of information have in common that we can use to create an argument in our essay? Again, to analyze something means to take the larger picture and pull it apart into smaller pieces and then see what those smaller pieces say together. So, all three pieces of information we've just taken out of our source have to do with person-to-person interaction. So, when we analyze this source and pull out these pieces of information, we can say that person-to-person communication had a large role in shaping and spreading the dragon legend. Now, this is something that the original source definitely said, but because we've singled out these pieces of information, we've singled out this argument in the larger body of work. Just like with our cat puzzle, if we pull out the pieces with the yellow flowers, all those yellow flowers were there originally, but when you put them together, they do a better job of explaining the variety of yellow that is in the original jigsaw puzzle. So how can you be sure that your analysis is done right? As always, you must be able to explain your thinking both to yourself and to your reader, because your reader is not going to have all the original pieces to see for themselves what you removed them from and how you made your analysis and conclusion. You're going to have to explain where you got these pieces from and what they say together in order for your reader to understand. Again, it's always back to that metacognition, making sure that the choices you've made, the pieces that you've pulled out, really do go together, and ask yourself what they say, if they do together, and how you can base a conclusion on that information. Does it truly follow from your information? And are there gaps in your information? These are all questions you should be asking yourself while you're doing this metacognition. And to one more time, bring it back to that puzzle. Find out where the logical pieces to remove are. So if you're thinking about yellow flowers, take out only the yellow flowers. Indicate a trend of yellow in those pieces. Don't take out a little bit of yellow here and a little bit of cat here and try to make a conclusion off of pieces that don't really go together. To double check yourself in this metacognitive process, ask yourself the following questions. First, does your analysis come to a logical conclusion? Does it actually make sense to you, and would it make sense to your reader? Further, ask yourself if your biases are coloring this conclusion that you've made. Again, you should not be using information from your own opinions and your own self, but solely from the source material that you've been given. Another very important question to ask is if you're using all relevant and all available information, because in order to make the best analysis possible, you should use as much information as you possibly can and find the information that is solely relevant to you within that larger body of work. If there's a chapter in the back of your source book that you just don't want to read, but maybe it's got some good information, so you have to at least skim it or read the title and the table of contents to make sure you're using all information that is available to you and making sure you're not forgetting any important, relevant information that could bolster up your paper. Lastly, if this were a jigsaw puzzle and you were to put the pieces back together, would they still make the same picture? Because if you were to accidentally alter that information, put in some of your own biases, that piece would not look the same when you tried to put it back into the original work. Maybe you colored it a different color in order to make it fit with your point that you're arguing in your paper, but that is not what the original source material says. So make sure that you leave every piece intact when you're analyzing it so that you don't misconstrue what your source material is actually saying.